She raised my rent for the fourth time in 7 months, the morning after I saw her standing barefoot at her kitchen window at 6 in the morning, hair down, completely unguarded, looking at a courtyard she clearly wasn't seeing. The door to her apartment had not fully latched. I was already on the staircase. I had 3 seconds through a gap I was not supposed to have. 3 seconds of the version of Vera Lund she had decided the world was not permitted to see, and I stood in those 3 seconds and understood something I could not unlearn. I kept walking. I did not make a single sound. The rent increase notice was in my mailbox by 9. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I had first moved into the Rennick building 14 months ago, for the same reason most people move into apartments they cannot quite afford. The rent was listed online at a number that was technically possible. The location was 15 minutes from the studio where I worked as a sound engineer, and the building had a quality of quiet that I had not found anywhere else in my search. Not silent, quiet. There is a difference, and I had been chasing the difference for 2 years of sublets and month-to-months and one disastrous 6-month arrangement in a building that shared ventilation with a dumpling restaurant. The Rennick building was 4 stories, 8 units, and it smelled like old wood and the very faint trace of something green that I later identified as the potted rosemary on the second-floor landing that belonged to the woman in 2A, who had been here for 9 years and whose name was Petra, and who knew everything about this building, and everyone in it, and shared none of it unsolicited. The building was owned and managed by Vera Lund, who lived in 1A, the first-floor unit at the end of the corridor, whose door was the only one on the ground floor. She had owned the building for 8 years. She had bought it from a commercial estate, renovated it herself with a contractor she called once a week by first name only, and run it since then with the exacting attention of someone who considered the building an ongoing project rather than a passive asset. I knew these things because Petra had told me the first week when she came upstairs with a jar of something she said was a building tradition for new tenants. I had found out later that no such tradition existed, and Petra simply liked to be the first to establish the landscape of a new person's understanding. What Petra told me about Vera Lund was, she is fair, she is not warm, she will fix anything in 24 hours flat, she will remember everything you tell her, and she will not ask you a single personal question, which some people find refreshing and some people find unnerving. I had found it, in the beginning, refreshing. Vera Lund was 42 years old and carried herself the way people carry themselves when they have stopped needing anyone to validate the space they take up. She was tall in a way that was not about height specifically but about the quality of her stillness. When Vera stood somewhere, she stood there with the full weight of her presence. Nothing leaked into adjacent rooms. Her hair was dark, with gray coming in at the left temple, and she kept it pinned at the back, and the few times I had seen her close enough to see the pin itself, it was always the same one, tortoiseshell, slightly worn at the edge. She wore dark clothing in the way people wear a decision rather than a style, not for fashion, not for formality, just because she had determined that this was the version of herself that was correct. I had noticed in 14 months, and would not have admitted to anyone, hands that were capable rather than delicate. She had built things with those hands, fixed things. The contractor she called by first name was someone she worked alongside rather than hired out, and when the pipes in 3B had needed replumbing the previous March, she had spent a Tuesday and a Wednesday in the walls herself with a headlamp and a pipe wrench, and had emerged on Wednesday evening with her sleeves rolled and her shirt untucked, and a smear of something gray along one forearm, and had looked, in that moment, more herself than she ever did in the management posture. I had seen that. I had been coming home from the studio at 9 in the evening, and she had been in the corridor, and she had looked up when I came in, and said the pipes in 3B are going to hold. Sorry for the noise this week, and I had said it's fine. Thank you. And she had nodded, and gone back into her apartment, and the door had closed, and I had stood at the foot of the staircase for a moment before I went up. This is the part I am not going to make smaller. I had been aware of Vera Lund as something other than my landlady almost from the beginning. I am telling this honestly, because the honest version is the only version that makes the rest of it make sense. The first rent increase had come in month 3. $40. She had sent a notice by the building's email system, formal, correct, 60 days in advance as required. A line about operating costs and property taxes that was accurate and dry and gave me nothing to push back on. I had paid it. The second increase had come in month 5. Another $40. Same language, same notice period, same legitimate-sounding reason. I had knocked on her door after the second one. She had opened it in the dark slacks and white shirt she wore when she was not in the building clothes, which I had learned to distinguish. There was a glass of something on the table behind her wine, dark, barely touched. "I just want to understand the pattern," I had said. She had looked at me with those steady gray eyes that gave away nothing. "There are ongoing costs associated with maintaining the building at its current standard," she had said. "I give 60 days notice and the full legal requirement for disclosure." "I know," I had said. "I've read the lease. I'm asking about the pattern." She had held my gaze for one beat too long. Then she had said, "The increases are within the legal limit. If that ever changes, please let me know." And she had closed the door. Not rudely, not quickly, just closed it with the finality of someone who had ended the conversation at exactly the moment she had chosen to end it. I had stood in the corridor for a moment. The potted rosemary on the landing above had sent something faint down the stairwell, green and sharp. And I had thought, very precisely, and without wanting to, she is not telling me the real reason. The third increase had come in month 5, $30 that time. I had paid it. I had not knocked on her door. The fourth was waiting in my mailbox the morning after I saw her standing barefoot at the kitchen window at 6 in the morning. $50. The notice was immaculate. The language was correct. The reason given was annual adjustment in line with market rates. I read it twice in the building's lobby with my bag on my shoulder and my keys in my hand, and the morning light coming through the glass front door at an angle that made the whole entryway look briefly like something worth painting. Then I walked up to my apartment and sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes, and thought about the gray shirt and the bare feet and the 3 seconds through a door that was not all the way closed, and I thought about the pattern of increases that had no clear pattern, and I thought about the 4 months since the second increase when I had stopped knocking on her door and she had stopped speaking to me beyond necessary logistical exchanges, and I thought about the particular quality of the silence that had grown between us in those 4 months. Then I went to work. I mixed audio for 6 hours and ate lunch at my desk and came home at 7 and found Vera Lund in the corridor outside my door. She was not there for me. She was doing something with the light fixture at the end of the corridor, the one that had been flickering for 2 weeks in a way that was annoying but not dangerous. She had a small stepladder and the fixture panel open and a screwdriver in one hand. She was in the building clothes, worn dark jeans, a charcoal long sleeve, boots. Her hair was up. She glanced at me when I came in. I said, "There's another increase." She said, "Yes, it went out this morning." I said, "This is the 4th one in 7 months." She held my gaze briefly. Then she looked back at the fixture. "The increases are within," she began. I said, "I know they're within the legal limit. I've read the lease 4 times. I know exactly what you're permitted to do." She set the screwdriver down on the top of the stepladder, turned to face me. "Then what is it you want to say?" she asked. Her voice was the same as it always was, level. Not warm, not cold. The voice of a woman who had decided that professional clarity was the only register she was going to use, and who was very good at that decision, and whom I had been watching for 14 months break that decision by millimeters in moments she thought nobody saw. I said, "I want to know what it would take to stop." The light in the corridor was the regular evening light, the overheads that she had replaced last spring with something warmer. It was adequate. It was not particularly revealing, but I watched her face in it, and I saw the things she did when she was processing something she had not expected, a very small shift in the set of her jaw, a slight adjustment in the quality of her stillness. She said, "That's a strange question." I said, "It's a direct one. The increases started in month 3. There's no consistent pattern to the amounts or the timing. I'm a quiet tenant. I pay early. I've never once needed maintenance. I didn't address myself. There's no financial justification you haven't already tried. So I'm asking directly, what would it take to stop?" She looked at me for a long moment. If the increases have been an inconvenience, she said, carefully, you're within your rights to explore other housing options. I'm not leaving, I said. Something shifted in her. Not visibly. The way the air in a room shifts when a window opens somewhere you cannot see. Then the increases will continue at my discretion within legal parameters, she said. She picked up the screwdriver. She turned back to the fixture. The conversation was over by her decision, the same way conversations with Vera Lund always ended by her choosing the moment without asking anyone else's opinion. I went inside. I put my bag down and stood in my kitchen and thought about what I had just said. I'm not leaving. I had said it before I had decided to say it. The words had come out of some part of me that had already been decided for a while without informing the rest. I thought about the kitchen window, the gray shirt, the bare feet on the tile. I thought, she is doing this because she has to do something, and this is the thing she can do without saying what she cannot say. I did not knock on her door that night. The following morning I ran into her in the lobby again. She had the mail in her hand, building correspondence, the kind she sorted and distributed with the efficiency she brought to every administrative task. She looked up when I came down the stairs. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I said. I held the lobby door for her when she moved toward the exterior. She went through without looking at me. On the steps outside, she sorted 2 envelopes and did not look up when I passed her on the way to the street. I had been doing a version of this calculation for months, the one where I tried to determine exactly how much of what I was feeling was legitimate response to an observable pattern, and how much was something I had constructed out of a gap in a door, and a quality of silence, and the particular way she said my last name Calloway when she needed to address me, which was different from how she said anyone else's. I had asked Petra once, as casually as I could, whether Vera had always been this way with tenants, and Petra had looked at me with the bright intelligence of a woman who had been watching people from the second-floor landing for 9 years, and said, "Define this way." And I had said, "I don't know, private." And Petra had said, "Vera is private the same way weather is private. It's not about you specifically." I had thought about that for a long time. The 5th rent increase came in month 8. I did not read the notice in the lobby this time. I took it upstairs and read it at the kitchen table, and then set it face down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. $60. The reason given was structural maintenance reserve. I sat with it for 20 minutes. Then I went downstairs and knocked on her door. Between the 20-minute sitting and the moment I knocked, I did the calculation I had been avoiding for weeks. The calculation was simple. It had 2 sides. On one side, the increases were real, and they cost real money, and I was a sound engineer at a mid-sized studio, and the money mattered, full stop, regardless of anything else. On the other side, I had not left. 5 increases. Not one of them had made me search listings or call my agent or look at the price per square foot of comparable units and do the math that said I was being managed out. I had not left because I did not want to leave. That was the whole calculation. It fit on one line. I had not wanted to examine what that meant with too much precision, because precision in that direction led to the other calculation, the one I had been less willing to write down. That I cared about this building and its quality of quiet and its specific tenant at 2A, and the rosemary on the landing and the boiler that Vera knew how to fix in the dark, and that somewhere inside all of that, the reason I cared so much about all of it was that it was hers. That the building was an expression of something she had decided to build and maintain and protect, and that watching her protect it for 14 months had told me more about who she was than any number of conversations would have. The increases were wrong. The amounts were wrong. The timing was wrong. The reasons given were inadequate. And I had stayed for every single one of them. I went downstairs and knocked on her door. It was a Saturday afternoon. She answered in the building clothes again, which meant she had been doing something in the building or was about to, which was not unusual for a Saturday. She had a faint smear of something on the back of her left hand. Paint, possibly. She looked at me and did not speak first. I said, "The maintenance reserve line doesn't hold up. You sent the reserve fund statement in September. It's adequately capitalized," she said. "There are long-term projections that," I said, I pulled the city permits. There are no major structural projects planned or filed. There's nothing in the reserve fund statement that justifies another $60 increase 4 weeks after the last one. A silence. Longer than the ones before it. She looked at me with those gray eyes, and I looked back, and the afternoon light from the courtyard-facing window in the corridor did something to the angles of her face. She said, "You pulled the city permits." I said, "I'm an audio engineer. My entire job is finding the noise underneath the noise." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of a smile. In the way that the horizon is in the neighborhood of the sun without being the sun. She said, "You should have been an attorney." I said, "Tell me what you're actually doing." The hallway was quiet around us. From somewhere in the building came the distant sound of Petra's television on the floor above a cooking show, I thought. Something with applause. Outside, the afternoon was going gray at the edges, the way November afternoons do, the light losing confidence before it had quite decided to leave. Vera looked at me for a long time. She said, "The increases are legal." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking about legal. I'm asking about honest." Another long silence. I had learned to let her silences go as long as they needed to, because Vera Lund did not fill space with words when she had not decided what the words should be, and the decision was always visible if you knew how to watch for it. The slight tension in her shoulders, the set of her jaw, the quality of her stillness, which changed depending on what the stillness was containing. She said, "I need to finish something upstairs." The second-floor light switch in the stairwell. I said, "Vera." She stopped. I said, "I know you heard my question." She said, "Yes." I said, "And?" She looked at the wall, then back at me. She said, "It isn't a conversation I'm prepared to have." I said, "That's different from not having an answer." Something very small and very precise happened to her face. She said, "Yes, it is different." She went upstairs. I stood in the corridor and listened to her footsteps on the staircase and the faint creak of the second-floor landing, and then the quiet again. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and thought, she has an answer, she is not prepared to give it. And the increases will continue until something else happens, until something breaks open the preparation or removes the need for it. I did not know yet what that something would be. The thing about living in the same building as someone is that proximity has its own grammar. You learn a person not through conversations, but through pattern, the hour they collect mail, the rhythm of their footsteps at different times of day, the sound of the building, when they are in it, versus when they are not. I had learned Vera's grammar over 14 months the way I learned audio tracks, not by listening for the sound, but by learning the silence around it. She was always in the building before 7 in the morning. She left between 7:30 and 8, always through the front door, always with a bag that was organized rather than full whatever she needed, not more. She returned between 6 and 7 in the evening unless there was something in the building that needed attending, in which case, she returned earlier, and the corridor had the particular quality of someone already being in it when you hadn't expected. She had dinner alone. I knew this, because the sounds from 1A in the evenings were solitary sounds. One set of dishes, one chair, a record player she used sometimes in the late evening that played things I could occasionally identify if I was very quiet on the staircase, which I was ashamed to admit I had been, more than once. She had, as far as I could tell in 14 months, no partner. No regular visitor except the contractor, who came quarterly, and whose name was Gil, and who spoke to her in the shorthand of people who had been working together long enough to have their own language, and who had once passed me in the lobby and said, "She keeps this place like it's a living thing," which I had thought about for weeks. She kept this place like it was a living thing. In December, the building's boiler needed emergency work. It was a Tuesday evening, 8 o'clock, and the heat had gone out on the second and third floors, and the temperature outside was 4 degrees. Vera was in the boiler room before I had even registered the cold. I found out later from Petra that she had noticed the pressure drop on her own gauge in 1A, the one she kept there for exactly this reason, and had been in the basement with Gil on the phone within 6 minutes. I came downstairs at 8:30 to see if there was anything I could do, which I understood was mostly a pretext but which was also genuine. She was in the basement corridor in the work clothes with a headlamp pushed up on her forehead and a pipe wrench in one hand and a phone in the other, and she looked up when I appeared at the top of the basement stairs. She said, "It'll be resolved by 11. I'm sorry for the disruption." I said, "Is there anything I can do?" She looked at me. The headlamp cast a specific quality of light, the kind of light that exists in utility spaces and has no interest in flattery, the kind that shows exactly what is in front of it. She looked in it, like someone who was in exactly the right place for exactly the right reasons and did not need to perform anything about that. The collar of her work shirt was open at the throat. There was a smear of something dark along the back of her right hand. She had the very particular quality of focus she had when she was inside a problem she intended to solve, and the focus, in that light, in that corridor, was the most honest thing I had ever seen her wear. She said, "No, but thank you." I said, "I'll make coffee. When you're done." She looked at me for one beat. A single second in which something crossed her face that was not the professional assessment, and was not the landlady's composure, and was something else, something that registered and was immediately contained, the same way a sound registers in a room and then the room absorbs it, and you are left wondering whether you imagined the original. She said, "I don't need," and stopped. I waited. She said, "Thank you." I went upstairs and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and waited and thought about the 1 second in the basement corridor where her face had done the thing it occasionally did when she thought she was not being observed, or when she was being observed and something surprised her into momentary honesty. I had been cataloging those moments. I had not wanted to catalog them. I had done it anyway, the way you do things that mean something before you are ready to know what they mean. At 11:15, there was a knock on my door. She was still in the work clothes, the headlamp now in her hand, her hair slightly undone from the pin at the back, not down, just loosened, one strand at her left temple that had come free, and which she had not bothered to replace. She had wiped the grease from her forearm, but not entirely. She said, "The heat's back. I wanted to let you know directly." I said, "I know. I heard it come on. Come in." She looked at the open door. Then at me. She said, "I don't need to." I said, "I made enough coffee for 2 people. Come in." A pause. It was the kind of pause she gave to decisions she had already made and was determining whether to acknowledge making. She came in. She sat at my kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the mug I gave her and looked around my apartment with the particular attention she gave to spaces in her building. Not intrusive, just thorough, the evaluation of someone who was responsible for the structure around everything she was looking at, and took that responsibility literally. She said, "You've done something to the far wall." I had. I'd mounted 3 baffles for the home recording setup I used for remote sessions. "Acoustic treatment," I said. "For work." She looked at them. She said, "Those are properly anchored." I said, "I used the stud finder." She almost smiled. "Fractionally," I said. "I wanted to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking it as a person, not as a tenant." She looked at me over the mug. I said. She said nothing for a moment. I said, "You've been in this building every day for 14 months. I've seen you work on every system in it. You know every tenant's name and every quirk of the plumbing and the specific way the front door latch sticks in cold weather. And you have been raising my rent by amounts that make no consistent sense on a schedule that also makes no consistent sense. And when I ask you about it directly, you give me legal language, and then say, it's not a conversation you're prepared to have." I said. "So I'm asking as a person, are you all right?" She looked at her coffee mug. She said, "That is a very direct question." I said, "You told me once I should have been an attorney. Attorneys ask direct questions." The corner of her mouth moved, 1 millimeter. She said, "I'm all right." I said, "Is that the legal answer or the honest one?" She looked at me. The kitchen light was the warm overhead I had installed myself in month 2, replacing the harsh fluorescent the apartment had come with. In it, Vera Lund looked her age and also looked like someone who had not sat at someone else's kitchen table in a very long time and was only now registering that fact. She said, "I don't know how to answer that differently." I said, That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 14 months. A silence. Longer than the others. The building settled around us, the particular creak of old wood finding its temperature again after the boiler had come back on, the distant sound of Petra's television above, the November wind against the glass. She said, "The increases are not about costs." I held very still. She said, "I'm aware that you know that." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't have a better explanation to give you." I said, "You have an explanation. You said it's not a conversation you're prepared to have." She looked at the table. I said, "You don't have to have it tonight." She looked up. I said, "But I need you to know that I am not leaving. And I need you to know that I know it's not about the costs. And I need you to know that I've been paying attention. For 14 months. Something happened to her face. Not breaking, not dissolving. Something more like a wall. When a door opens in it, the wall is still there. But suddenly it has a door, and the door is open, and the light from the other side is making it very clear that the wall was always a choice and not a fact. She set the mug down. She said, "I need to think about something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'll send you a notice tomorrow." I said, "About the rent?" She said. She stood up. She picked up the headlamp from the table. She went to the door and paused with her hand on the frame and did not turn all the way around. She said, "You should have left, Calloway." I said, "I know." She said quietly, so quiet I almost missed it, "I didn't want you to." Then she went down the stairs. I sat at the kitchen table with 2 empty coffee mugs and the building quiet around me and thought about what comes after the thing finally gets said without being said, and whether the step after that was something either of us knew how to take. I thought about it until 2 in the morning. At 9, the next day, a notice appeared under my door. It was a single sheet of paper, the building's letterhead at the top, the way all her formal communication used it. It said, "Effective immediately, the rent for Unit 3B is reduced to the original lease rate and will remain fixed for the remainder of any renewed lease term. Any previous increases are considered administratively corrected. Please consider this a formal acknowledgement of that correction." Below the official block, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried, and looked exactly like someone who had written one careful line and stopped. "I am also free this weekend, if the other conversation needs a place to happen." I read it twice, standing in my kitchen in my socks at 9 in the morning, with the November light coming through the east window, the way it did at that hour, bright and provisional, the kind of light that doesn't promise to last, but while it's there, it makes everything look possible. I stood there for a long time. Then I went downstairs. She answered on the second knock. She was in the Saturday clothes, jeans, dark shirt, no work gear yet. Her hair was down. I had not expected that. She had not expected me to come so quickly. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I said, "This weekend works." Something in her face did the thing I had been watching it try not to do for 14 months. Not softening, exactly. Opening. The door in the wall, fully open. She said, "Come in." And I did. The apartment was not what I had imagined, though I had not let myself imagine it specifically. It was spare in the way things are spare when the person who lives in them has decided that they want only what they use and have been honest about what that is. A large table with the marks of working on it. Books shelved with the organizational logic of someone who reads them rather than displays them. The kitchen with the window that faced the courtyard, the window where she had stood in the gray shirt at 6 in the morning 7 months ago, the window that had started all of this. The coffee was already on. She had known I would come. She poured 2 cups, and we sat across from each other at the table with the marks on it, and she looked at me with the gray eyes that gave away less than they used to, and I looked back, and the building breathed around us the way it always did on a Saturday morning, slow and unhurried, like it had nowhere to be. She said, "I don't know how to have this conversation." I said, "You started it." She said, "I wrote a letter." I said, "Yes." She said, "I've written it 7 times. That was the 7th. I held that." She said, "The first one was in month 3. Month 3 was when the increases had started." I said, "You raised my rent because you wrote a letter you didn't send." She said, "I raised your rent because I needed to do something and that was the thing I could do without saying anything." I said. The increases were the letter. She was quiet. I said, every time you raised the rent, you were saying something you couldn't say. She said, that is a generous interpretation. I said, is it wrong? A long pause. She said, no. I said, what did the first 6 letters say? She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, they all said different versions of the same thing, that I had noticed you in a way I had not expected, that the noticing had become something I couldn't categorize correctly within the framework of this building and my role in it, that I didn't know what to do with it. I said, and the 7th one? She said, the 7th one said you are free this weekend. I sat with that for a moment. I said, the first 6 months, the 4 increases before tonight before the coffee, you let it go that long. She said, I was managing it. I said, by raising my rent. She said, yes. I said, Vera. She looked at me. I said, that is the least functional coping mechanism I have ever personally encountered. Something happened in her face that was, unmistakably, the thing that lived behind the careful management of everything she was, the thing that did not get to come out very often. It was a sound that came from somewhere genuine, a brief and startled laugh, gone quickly but real, and in the kitchen light with her hair down and the coffee between us, it made her look like a person who had been holding something in for so long that the release of a small piece of it was almost physical. She covered her mouth briefly with one hand. Then she looked at the table. I said, you could have just talked to me. She said, I know, I couldn't. I said, why? She said, because you're my tenant. Because this building is the thing I've built and I take that seriously. Because there are rules and I believe in the rules for reasons that are not abstract. I said, and? She said, and because I didn't know if what I was noticing was mutual, and I would rather raise your rent 4 times than have that conversation and have it land wrong. I said, you could have asked. She said, I couldn't ask. I can build a boiler room from scratch. I can read a permit filing at 2 a.m. I can tell you the load-bearing capacity of every wall in this building. I cannot ask that question. I said, then I'll tell you. She looked at me. I said, it's mutual. It has been for a long time. Probably since the day in March when you came out of the walls in the work clothes with the headlamp and the grease on your arm and looked at me like I was interrupting something important and then said sorry for the noise this week. She stared at me. I said, I went upstairs and sat on my kitchen floor and thought about it for 20 minutes. She said, the pipes. That was month 3. I said, month 3. Yes. She said, quietly. That was when the first letter happened. We looked at each other across the marked-up table in the first-floor apartment with the coffee going cool between us and the November building breathing around us, and the courtyard window behind her showing the climbing plant and the iron table and the gray Saturday morning light. She said, I don't know how to do this part. I said, which part? She said, the part after the letter. I said, I think you start with the thing you've been not saying, the part that isn't the management language. She looked at the table, then back at me. Her hands were around the coffee cup and she was not fidgeting, and she was not performing stillness, she was just still, the genuine version, the version that was not management but presence. She said, I watched you, in this building, for 14 months, and every time you came through the front door I knew it. And every time I sent you a rent increase notice, I felt it like something I was doing wrong and did it anyway, because the alternative was this, and I didn't think I was going to be able to do this. I said, you're doing it. She said, I'm terrified. The word landed in the kitchen, like something that had been held up a long time, and finally set down. Vera Lund, who had replumbed a building herself and written 7 letters she didn't send and managed a feeling for 7 months with rent increases because it was the only tool she trusted herself to use. Sitting across from me at 9 a.m. on a Saturday saying terrified without the management language around it. I said, me too. She looked at me. I said, I'm not leaving. I told you that in the corridor. She said, yes. I said, I meant it about more than the apartment. She was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet, not the managed quiet, not the containing quiet, the listening kind. I got up from my chair and walked around the table. She turned to face me, and I crouched down to be at her level, and I put my hand on the table next to hers, close but not touching. I said, "You don't have to figure out the whole thing right now." She looked at my hand. Then at my face. I said, "We can start with the part that's already true." She said, "What part is that?" I said, "The part where you knew I was coming down the stairs at 6 in the morning last November, and you left the door not quite closed." She went very still. I said, "I don't think it was an accident." A long pause. She said very quietly, "No," I said. "So you were telling me something then too?" She said, "I didn't know I was telling you anything. I didn't realize until—" She stopped. I said, "Until?" She said, "Until you didn't say anything about it the next day. And I understood that you'd seen, and that you hadn't said anything. And that meant—" She stopped again. I said, "It meant I was keeping it." She looked at me. I said, "I was keeping it. I've been keeping it since November." She reached out and her hand covered mine on the table, warm and certain in the way her hands were certain about everything. And the contact was the simplest possible thing, and also the furthest distance she had ever crossed in the direction of anything she wanted, and I could feel it in the quality of her stillness, which had shifted entirely from the stillness of containment to the stillness of someone who had put something down and was not sure yet what their hands were going to do now that they were empty. I turned my hand over and held hers. She looked at our hands on the table. She said, "I'm going to need to restructure the lease." I said, "I assumed." She said, "There are ethical considerations with the property relationship." I said, "I know." She said, "I'll need to speak to an attorney about the appropriate framework for—" I said, "Vera?" She stopped. I said, "I know you need to do all of that. I know you'll do it correctly and completely, and the documentation will be perfect." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm telling you that you don't have to do it right now." She looked at me. I said, "Right now you could just be in this kitchen." She was quiet for a moment. The building breathed around us. The courtyard outside was doing something with the winter light that made the climbing plant on the wall look silver instead of brown. The coffee was cold. Neither of us was going anywhere. She said, "I haven't done this in a long time." I said, "This?" She said, "Sat in a kitchen with someone. Just sat." I said, "You're good at it." The corner of her mouth, 1 millimeter, then more than that. She said, "Callaway." I said, "Yes?" She said, "I'm going to stop raising your rent." I said, "I noticed." She said, "I should have stopped a long time ago." I said, "You stopped when you were ready." She said, "That's too generous." I said, "Okay, you stopped when something changed." She said, "What changed?" I said, "I asked you directly what it would take." She looked at me. She said, "No one had ever done that before." I said, "Asked directly?" She said, "Stayed." Asked directly. Stayed. I held that. I said, "I told you I wasn't leaving." She said, "You told me." "Yes." I said, "Did you believe me?" A pause. She said, "I wanted to." I said, "And now?" She looked at our hands, still together on the marked-up table. She said, "Yes." Outside, the November morning was doing what November mornings do, working toward gray, not quite there yet, the light provisional and precise. Inside, the building was the particular quiet of a Saturday when all its tenants are where they are supposed to be, which is to say, safe, which is to say, home. Vera Lund had built this place into something that held, and she was sitting in it now, with her hand in mine and her hair down and the coffee cold between us. And I thought that whatever came next was going to require time and patience and the kind of honesty that does not have a management language and cannot be drafted 7 times into something safe. I thought, good. We stayed in the kitchen until noon. Not talking the entire time. That was the surprising part. I had expected, once the door was open, that words would come pouring through it the way they do when pressure has been building behind something for a long time. Instead, what came through was the quieter thing. The kind of quiet that is not avoidance, but its opposite. Two people who had been performing the management of their awareness of each other for 14 months, discovering that the performance was exhausting and that sitting in a kitchen without it was something neither of them had to learn, because they already knew how. She made more coffee at 9:30. She moved around her kitchen with the economy she brought to everything she did in this building, purposeful, precise, nothing wasted. But there was something different in it now, something I was trying to name. It was not that she was more relaxed, it was that the efficiency was not in service of distance anymore. She was not moving around the kitchen to have something to do with her hands while she managed the proximity. She was just making coffee. She brought 2 cups back to the table and sat down. She looked at me. She said, "You mentioned you could hear my record player." "From the staircase." I said, "Sometimes. When the building was very quiet." She said, "What did you hear?" I said, "Different things. A few weeks ago, something with a lot of piano. Before that, something older. Strings." She said, "The piano was Ravel, the strings were Barber." I said, "I know the Barber, the Adagio." She said, "Yes." I said, "That's a specific mood." She said, "It was a specific evening." I said, "What happened?" She looked at the cup in her hands. She said, "You had come home with someone. A friend, I think. I heard you laughing in the stairwell." "It was..." She stopped. I said, "It was what?" She said, "Difficult. That is the word I would use." I looked at her. I had not known she was aware of that evening. I had not thought about whether she would be. It had been a colleague from the studio, someone I had known for 3 years, and we had shared a bottle of wine in my apartment and talked about nothing in particular, and he had left at 10, and I had felt, after, the particular flatness of an evening that had been fine, but not what either of you needed. I said, "That was a friend. Nothing more." She said, "I know that now." I said, "You didn't know then?" She said, "No." I said, "And it bothered you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "How long had it been bothering you?" "Before that specific evening." A pause. She said, "Since March." March was the pipes, the headlamp, the grease on her forearm. I said, "Month 3. She said, "Yes." I said, "The first rent increase was in month 3. She said, "Yes." I sat with that for a moment. The timeline of it, the way the things she could not say and the things she could not stop doing, had started at exactly the same moment, the same month, connected by a causal chain that made a kind of devastating logic, now that I could see the whole of it. I said, "You heard me laughing in the stairwell with someone you thought might matter to me, and you went inside and put on Barber and didn't do anything else about it." She said. I said, "Vera." She looked at me. I said, "That's a very lonely way to spend an evening." Something moved through her face. Not breaking, just acknowledging. The way a person acknowledges a thing that is true and was true for a while, and that they have been too busy managing to let themselves feel the truth of. She said, "I'm aware." I said, "You didn't have to be alone with it." She said, "I didn't know how to be anything else with it." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine again. She looked down at the contact. She did not move her hand. She said, "I'm going to need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I am not saying it to make you feel responsible for it. I'm saying it because you asked for the honest version." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The increases were not just about not knowing what else to do. They were also, I was watching to see what you would do. Each time, whether you would leave." I held very still. She said, "That was wrong. I know it was wrong. I was using a real financial cost to measure something that was not mine to measure that way." I said, "You were testing me." She said, "I would not use that word. I was watching to see if the building would be enough to make you stay. And every time you stayed, I raised the amount, because I needed to know how much it would take." I looked at her. My landlady, who had spent 7 months raising my rent incrementally, not only because she could not say what she felt, but because some part of her, the part that had built this building and kept it and made it hold, needed to know whether someone would stay inside it at the price of honest difficulty. "Whether I would stay." I said, You could have just asked me to stay. She said, I know. I said, I would have said yes. She said, I know that now. I said, how do you know? She said, because you told me you weren't leaving. And because you knocked on my door twice. And because you made coffee at 11:15 on a Tuesday in December, and waited. I said, you noticed all of that. She said, I notice everything about you. I have, since March. That is the problem I have been managing, and the thing I was not prepared to tell you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the courtyard window, the winter light had settled into the flat white of a November noon, no longer provisional, just present. The climbing plant on the far wall was doing nothing in particular. The iron table was empty as it always was. I said, it's not a problem anymore. She looked at me. I said, the thing you were managing, you don't have to manage it. She said, I don't know how to not manage things. I said, I know. I've watched you manage this building for 14 months. You manage things the way other people breathe. She said, is that a criticism? I said, no, it's an observation. You built this place, and you kept it, and you manage it, because you love it. The management is the love. For you. I understand that. She was quiet. I said, but I'm not the building. She said, no. I said, so you don't have to manage me. She looked at me for a long time. In the noonlight, her face was the most readable it had ever been, not because she had stopped being private, but because she had stopped using privacy as a wall and had let it become instead what it actually was. The particular quality of a person who chose carefully what to share, and had, in this kitchen, on this Saturday, chosen to share the real version. She said, I'm not going to be easy. I said, I know. She said, I mean that specifically. I work constantly. I find it difficult to ask for things. I am better at fixing a boiler than at saying that I missed someone. I will send you formal notices when I am feeling something I have not categorized yet, because it is the only language I trust. I said, the notices are actually very good writing. She stared at me. I said, the language is dry, but the structure is precise. I've been reading them for 7 months. You have a very specific way of saying almost something while saying nothing. Something happened in her face again, the startled, brief thing, the laugh that came from the real place rather than the managed place. She covered her mouth. She said, you are infuriating. I said, you said I should have been an attorney. She said, I'm rethinking it. I said, Vera. She looked at me with the gray eyes that had been giving away nothing for 14 months and were now, in the noon light of her kitchen on a Saturday in November, giving away everything they had ever contained. I said, I have been falling for you since March. Since the pipes. Since the grease on your arm and the headlamp pushed up on your forehead and the way you said sorry for the noise this week like the noise was a personal failing and not a building system malfunction. I have been keeping that since month 3, the same month you sent the first increase. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it and because you made it very clear that there was no door in the wall and I respected that. I said, but there was always a door. You just hadn't opened it yet. She looked at me. She said, you knew. I said, I suspected. Since November. Since the gap in the door. She said, I didn't know you'd seen. I said, you left the door unlatched. She said quietly, I know I did. I said, was that an accident? A long pause. She said, I don't know. I've been asking myself that for 7 months. I don't know if it was accident or something else entirely. I know that I stood at that window for 20 minutes and that I thought about you the entire time and that when I heard the staircase, I did not close the door. I said, what were you thinking about? She said, the same thing I've been thinking about since March. I said, which is? She looked at her hands. Then at me. She said, what it would be like to be honest with you, what it would cost, whether the cost was survivable. I said, is it? She said, I don't know yet. I said, you're still here? She said, yes. I said, that's data. The corner of her mouth moved. More than a millimeter this time. Enough to count as something real, something that had a name. I got up from my side of the table. She tracked the movement with her eyes but did not move. I walked around the table to her side and crouched down to her level the way I had earlier, close enough that the space between us was no longer the length of a table but something much smaller and much more deliberate. She looked at me. She did not move back. I said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need the real answer. Not the management version, not the legal parameters version." She said, "All right." I said, "Can I stay?" A silence. Not the managed kind, the listening kind, the kind where something is being weighed very honestly. She said, "In my apartment?" I said, "For now." "Yes." She said, "For now meaning?" I said, "Meaning as long as you want, meaning I'm not leaving." Meaning the question was never about the apartment. She held my gaze for one long, open beat. She said, "Yes." I said, "Which question?" She said, "Both of them." I put my hand against her jaw, warm, the exact temperature I had been imagining since November. She went very still under the touch, not the stillness of containment, but the stillness of someone who had finally stopped moving away from a thing and was letting it arrive. I said, "The 7 letters." She said, "Yes?" I said, "Did any of them start with your name?" She said, "All of them ended with mine." I kissed her. Not urgently. Patient was the word, the kind of patience that is not restraint but its completion, the thing that restraint has been pointing toward the whole time without saying so. She kissed me back with the same quality, the same measured certainty she brought to everything she built, and her hand came up and settled at my waist and stayed there the way her hand stayed on anything she intended to keep, steady and deliberate, and without any performance of casualness. We stayed like that for a long time. When I sat back, she looked at me with the gray eyes and the hair still down and the particular expression of a woman who has just done the thing she has been not doing for 7 months and is only now understanding the specific size of what she had been containing. She said, "I should have sent the 7th letter in month 3. I said, "You would have." She said, "I wasn't ready." I said, "I know. You were ready when you were ready." She said, "That is still too generous." I said, "It is generous. You're going to have to get used to that." She looked at me. She said, "Is that a warning?" I said, "It's a preview." The afternoon went the way afternoons go, when something large has finally been put down, and you are both sitting in the space it used to occupy. We talked, not about the building, not about the lease she still needed to restructure, not about the attorney, or the ethical framework, or the administrative corrections she had already made to my rent. We talked about other things. The studio where I worked. The years she had spent before the building, working in structural engineering, which explained the pipe wrench and the headlamp, and the way she read a load-bearing wall the way I read an audio track. The city she had lived in before this one, which had been larger and louder, and from which she had taken nothing except one box of books and the knowledge of exactly what she did and did not need. I said, "Why this building?" She said, "I wanted something I could be responsible for, something that needed a specific kind of attention." I said, "You could have bought a house." She said, "A house is for one person. A building is a system." I said, "You like systems." She said, "I trust systems. I know how to make them work. I know what happens when one component fails and what it costs the rest of the structure." I said, "Is that a metaphor?" She said, "No. It was a literal observation about building management." I said, "Are you sure?" She looked at me. She said, "I think I am capable of having a conversation about structural engineering without it being a metaphor." I said, "The woman who wrote 7 letters about her feelings and sent none of them and instead raised my rent is telling me she can talk about structure without it being a metaphor." A pause. She said, "That is a fair point." I said, "I thought so." She was quiet for a moment. The record player was on. She had put something on at noon. Something spare and unhurried, with a single instrument working through a theme I couldn't name. It was exactly the right thing for the light and the hour and the quality of the afternoon. She said, "I didn't know how to be the person who says things directly. I learned to say them indirectly, because indirect was survivable. If you said a thing directly, and it landed wrong, There was no going back. If you set it in code, in rent increases, in record players, in doors that did not fully close, you could always claim it was something else. I said, "Did you ever actually need to claim it was something else?" She said, "No." I said, "Because I never pushed until I did." She said, "Yes." I said, "And then you answered." She said, "Eventually." I said, "Vera, you answered on the second knock." She looked at the table. She said, "On the second knock?" I said, "That's not someone who needed 7 months. That's someone who needed to be asked." She said quietly, "Yes." I said, "So ask me things." She looked up. I said, "From now on, when you want to know something, when you are playing barber in the evenings because something happened and you don't know what to do with it, ask me," she said. I said, "Write it down, I'll read it. I've been reading your notices for 7 months and they are, I want to say again, genuinely well-structured documents." She put her hand over her eyes briefly. She said, "You are going to be very strange to be with." I said, "Probably. Is that a problem?" She said, "No." She said it the way she said things that were true and did not need elaboration. One word: complete. In the weeks that followed, Vera did the things she had said she would do. She spoke to an attorney about the property relationship and the ethical considerations of the landlord-tenant dynamic. She restructured the lease with a third-party property management company, handling the administrative relationship so that there was a clean professional line between what she owned and what we were building in the space that had nothing to do with ownership. She sent me a formal document about the changes that was, as promised, very well structured, and left no ambiguity about the new arrangement. She also, for the first time in 8 years, according to Petra, left her apartment door open on a Saturday morning. Petra had been, about this development, entirely unsurprised. She had come downstairs to get her mail on the Saturday, 3 weeks after the kitchen morning, and found both my door on the 3rd floor and Vera's door on the 1st floor standing open, and had stood in the lobby for a moment and then gone back upstairs with her mail and later told me she had said a small, quiet thank you to nobody in particular. I had moved some things into her apartment gradually, not formally, not with boxes and a lease amendment and a date, just the natural accumulation of a person who spent more evenings in a place than they did anywhere else. My good headphones, the book I was reading, a second coffee cup that appeared in her cabinet and was never remarked upon. She remarked upon nothing. She made room for things without being asked. That was how Vera showed what she did not know how to say directly. She made room. Physically, literally. She cleared a shelf, moved things on the bathroom counter, kept the spare key on the hook by the door, rather than in the utility drawer where she had kept all the spares before. I understood her language. It was just a different kind of structure. Gil, the contractor, met me in the lobby in January. He shook my hand with the solemnity of a man who had known Vera Lund for 12 years and had opinions about the kind of people she allowed close to her and had decided to have a quiet look at this one. He said, "You know, she built most of the interior herself." After the renovation crew left, I said, "I didn't know that specifically." He said, "The bookshelves, the kitchen counters, the landing planters. She's better with her hands than most of the people I contract." I said, "I believe it." He said, "She doesn't let people in easily." I said, "I know." He said, "She let you in." I said, "Eventually." He looked at me for a moment with the assessment of someone who repaired things for a living and had learned to identify the difference between something that would hold and something that looked like it would hold. He said, "Good." He went out through the front door. I stood in the lobby and thought about holding. Petra was less subtle about it. In February, she knocked on my door with a jar she said was for me specifically, and when I opened it I said, "What is this?" And she said, "It's the building tradition for people who figure something out." And I said, "There is no building tradition." And she said, "There is now." I brought the jar downstairs and set it on Vera's kitchen table. She looked at it. She said, "Petra." I said, "Yes." She said, "Petra has been watching this building for 9 years. I said, "She said 9. Vera said. She told me in October that I should say something. I said, October. She said, October. We were in the corridor and you had just come home and she passed me on the staircase afterward and she said, Vera, say something. And I said, I don't know what you're referring to. And she said, yes, you do. I said, what did you do after that? She said, I went inside and wrote the 5th letter. I looked at her. She said, the 5th increase came after that. I sent the increase instead of the letter. I said, Vera. She said, I know. I said, Petra told you in October, and you sent an increase instead, and then 3 more increases, and then a letter at the bottom of a formal notice. She said, that is an accurate timeline. I said, you are the most complicated person I have ever been in a kitchen with. She said, I told you I was not going to be easy. I said, you told me. She said, you stayed anyway. I said, I told you I wasn't leaving. She looked at me. In the February light, with Petra's jar on the table between us and the record player, not on yet, and the building breathing its particular Saturday quiet around us, she looked like a woman who had been building things that held for a long time and had only recently understood that some things hold differently than walls. I said, come here. She got up from her chair and came around the table, and I pulled her into me, and she settled there with the particular quality of someone who had been resisting the pull of something for a very long time and had finally stopped, not because the pull went away, but because the resistance was no longer necessary. Her hands found my waist. My arms went around her. We stood in her kitchen in February, with Petra's jar on the table, and neither of us said anything for a long time. She smelled like cedar, and the cold outside air, and the very faint trace of whatever she had been doing in the building before I came home. I pressed my face against her hair, she said, into my shoulder. I sent the 5th letter after October. I said, I know. She said, and then I sent an increase. I said, I know. She said, I was afraid. I said, I know. She said, are you going to keep saying I know? I said, yes. Because I do know. I knew before you said it. That's the part I need you to understand. I knew, and I stayed. And you can stop being afraid of that now. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I'm not afraid of that anymore. I said, good. She said, I'm afraid of other things. I said, tell me. She said, not right now. I said, when? She said, when I know what words to use. I said, or you could just send me a formal notice. She made a sound against my shoulder that was, unmistakably, the laugh. The real one. Not the brief startled one, but the longer version. The one that came from the same place and lasted long enough to be something she couldn't take back. I held her while she laughed. It felt like holding something that had been very tightly wound for a very long time and was only now remembering how to uncoil. The months after that had the particular quality of things that are being built slowly and correctly. No shortcuts, no performance, just the accumulation of one true thing on top of another until the structure could bear weight. We disagreed, sometimes because Vera had strong opinions about how things should be done and I had strong opinions about what things were worth doing, and the intersection of these two facts produced, on a Wednesday in March, a full 45-minute conversation about whether the 3rd-floor stairwell light should be on a timer or a motion sensor that was actually underneath, about control and preference, and the specific language we each used when we were right about something and knew it. She won the argument. The light was on a motion sensor. I told her she was right at 9 in the evening and she said, I know. And the way she said it was the version that meant both, I know I was right and I know you. Telling me costs you something, and I appreciate that. She had learned to say more with 2 words than most people said in a paragraph. I had stopped being surprised by this and started being grateful for it. In April, the building's courtyard had its first real spring day, the kind where the climbing plant on the far wall put out new growth, and the iron table that nobody ever used had someone sitting at it for the first time since I had moved in. That someone was Vera, with a cup of coffee and a building inspection report. In the morning before the rest of the tenants were up, I brought 2 cups out. She looked up when I came through the door. She did not look surprised. She made space at the table. I sat down. I said, is this the table nobody uses? She said, Apparently not anymore. I said, you never sat out here before. She said, I had no reason to. I said, and now? She looked at the courtyard in the morning light, the climbing plant, the tile, the particular geometry of a space that had been unused and well kept at the same time. She said, now I have a reason. We sat at the iron table that nobody used and drank coffee in the April morning, and the building existed around us the way it always had, holding its tenants and their habits and their small particular lives. Petra would be up soon. The sounds of the building waking would come through the courtyard door. The day would unfold the way days unfold when you are inside something that is real and functional and yours. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, the same motion she had made in the kitchen in November, warm, certain, deliberate. But different now. The November version had been a crossing. This was just contact, just presence. The thing itself, no longer the admission of the thing. I said, I have a question. She said, ask. I said, the 7 letters, do you still have them? A pause. She said, yes. I said, would you let me read them? She looked at me. She said, eventually. I said, when? She said, when I'm ready. I said, that's very reasonable. She said, I have my moments. I said, you have a lot of moments, I've been keeping track. She said, what kind of moments? I said, the kind where you say exactly the thing that is true, and then look at me like you're not sure I'll survive it. She said, do you? I said, survive it? She said, yes. I said, every time. She looked at the courtyard. The climbing plant was doing something small and green in the April light. The building breathed behind us. She said, Calloway? I said, yes. She said, I'm glad you didn't leave. I said, I told you I wasn't going to. She said, I know. I'm still glad. I turned my hand over under hers and held it. The sun was coming up properly now over the roofline of the building across the street. It came into the courtyard at an angle that caught the new growth on the climbing plant, and the surface of the table, and the line of Vera's jaw, and the gray at her left temple, where the tortoiseshell pin usually sat. Her hair was down. It was Tuesday. She had nowhere to be for another hour and a half. I had the morning session at the studio at 9. We had exactly that long, and we used it the way she managed everything she valued, with attention, with intention, without wasting a single minute of what we had been given. She said my name. Not Calloway, my actual name, the short one. The one she had used exactly twice before today, and which sounded different in her voice than it did in anyone else's, for reasons I had stopped trying to be rational about. It sounded like something she had been carrying carefully for a long time, and was now setting down in the correct place. I said, yes? She said, nothing. Nothing. I said, say it. She said, I was going to say I'm glad. I already said that. I said, say it again. She looked at me in the April morning light, with the gray eyes and the hair down and the warmth of her hand against mine. She said, I'm glad. I said, me too. We stayed there until the city finished waking up around us, and the morning session at the studio became something I was going to be 3 minutes late for, and did not particularly mind. Inside, on the kitchen counter, her coffee was going cold. Neither of us went back for it. Petra knocked at noon with something she said was for the table. She looked at the 2 cups and the 2 chairs and the general evidence of the morning and said, good, and left. Vera watched her go. She said, she's been waiting for that knock since October. I said, she told you to say something in October. She earned it. Vera said, she earned it in month 3. I said, month 3. She said, when I walked past your door the morning after the pipes and you had music on inside. And Petra was coming down the stairs and she looked at me and she said, that's the one, isn't it? I stared at her. She said, I told her I didn't know what she was referring to. I said, and? She said, yes you do, and went downstairs. I said, Petra has been watching this building for 9 years. She said, 9 years. I said, she knew in month 3. She said, she knew before month 3. She said later that she knew the day you moved in. She could tell by the way I held the door. I said. How did you hold the door? Vera looked at me, the gray eyes, the particular quality of someone who had written 7 letters and sent one, and was standing in the consequence of that choice, and finding the consequence livable. More than livable, she said, like I didn't want you to leave. She had never wanted me to leave. She had raised my rent 4 times and sent notice after notice, and managed and contained and restructured and drafted and discarded, and finally, on a November Saturday, with the building around us and the coffee going cold and her hair down for the first time I had ever seen it, she had said, "Come in." I had come in. I was still here. I was going to keep being here. The April courtyard smelled like the climbing plant coming back, and the cold still in the iron of the table, and the specific morning particular of the city before it fully woke. Vera's hand was in mine. The building held us the way she had built it, to hold everything she valued, with structure, with care, with the quiet confidence of something that had been made to last. This is what I would have told you in month 3, if I had known. That the woman at the window in the gray shirt at 6 in the morning was not showing you something by accident. That the door was not unlatched because of the weather. That the rent increases were the letters, and the letters were the only thing she knew how to write until you asked her to say it out loud. That asking directly is sometimes the whole answer. That staying is sometimes the whole argument. That the building was always a love letter. She just needed someone who would read it,